We are going to talk in this video about divorce fraud and bankruptcy fraud. So in divorce fraud, we'll talk about that first. A couple is getting divorced, and one of the spouses is committing fraud against the other one. So the plaintiff, the one who's saying, hey, I've been wronged, they go to court and they say that other spouse is committing fraud against me. To prove that it's fraud, they have to prove that that spouse lied. They have to prove that the spouse knew it was a lie. They didn't just undervalue it because, well, I got it appraised. The guy said this. I didn't know what it was worth, right? They have to know it was misappraised. And they were trying to get that other party in the divorce to settle for less. This most frequently, I would say, happens when a divorce involves somebody who's self-employed, who has a business. And so, one of the spouses is primarily involved in the business, and it kind of belongs to them, but they still are supposed to split half with that other spouse. And so they try to make the business seem more like it's worth less than it is, because they don't want to pay out to that spouse to keep the business. So there's kind of two ways they accomplish this. One, they either hide assets, right? So they just take them offshore, they put them in other people's name, they create a trust of some kind and put it all in that, so that one spouse can't find it because it's not in their name. Or they just assign values that are unrealistically low, right? Well, this business, I had the business appraised and it's only worth $100,000, so here's $50,000, when really it's worth, $1 million, right? So they don't want to have to pay out to get that other spouse out of the business. Who's in a divorce? Well, there's marital parties, attorneys for both sides, and divorce court, right? So when a divorce happens, you've got the two people getting divorced, they've each got their own attorneys, and then there's a court where there's a judge who's going to make the decision about splitting up these assets. Now, when there's a divorce, typically they're hiding assets, and the attorney is trying to help find those assets. They can actually get, if you're an investigator investigating the spouse that's hiding the assets, you can get the divorce court to issue subpoenas and allow different investigative techniques. So you're trying to make sure that that things are being divided fairly. Sometimes it is possible for people to commit a crime while they're getting divorced, in the case of hiding assets from one spouse and another. And we're not talking about anything to do with like child custody or anything like that. We're just talking about when people get married and they, over the course of the marriage, they build up assets and now they got to split them up. And so frequently one spouse has more access to the assets than the other, or more knowledge of them, because again, typically these are involving a business owned by the couple, but really maybe one is actually more in charge of running it or more in charge of the finances. So they're able to hide it from that spouse. And it is possible to use the court to help you track down the assets. And it is possible for the spouse hiding it to actually commit a crime. And as a result of trying to cheat the other spouse, they can actually end up in jail. Now, bankruptcy can actually be happening during a divorce. They can actually be quite tied in together. Frequently, they are, because as people split up, now they have these liabilities they've built up during the course of their marriage, mortgages, and if there's a business involved, business type loans. And if they're going to split up things, they may not now have the ability to repay those. But that's not always the case in bankruptcy, but many bankruptcies are the result of a divorce, but not all. Some are just poor business decisions or poor personal decisions. A person can declare bankruptcy, a business can declare bankruptcy. So like divorce, when there's a bankruptcy, typically the party going bankrupt wants to keep as many of their assets as they can, so they hide them or undervalue them, right? And again, like in divorce, there's a court involved. So they're having to go before a court and swear these are the values. So they can actually be committing crimes by lying in a bankruptcy. So typically they won't list assets. They will transfer to other people, right? So just like with a divorce, they'll lie about the assets that they have, not list them, say they're not worth as much, or transfer them out so that they're not part of the bankruptcy. There are other schemes in bankruptcy, so you do have third parties involved, right? So when a person or business declares bankruptcy, there's going to be an attorney involved. When it goes to a court, there's a judge involved in making decisions, and that judge is going to appoint somebody called a bankruptcy trustee. So the judge, who's over all the bankruptcies, doesn't have time to personally supervise getting assets, selling assets, dividing money between creditors, right? So you can imagine a business that's declaring bankruptcy has many creditors, right? They've borrowed money from this bank, that bank. They've purchased some inventory and have accounts payable from these different vendors. There could be quite a few creditors involved. And then they have the assets of the business. So there has to be somebody kind of in charge of deciding what assets are there, who's going to get paid, and that's what they call a bankruptcy trustee. So these are people appointed by the court to decide what happens. Well, if you think about it, the trustees and attorneys involved could start committing fraud, right? Like, I'm going to take this asset, sell it, and pay a little towards that creditor and keep some for me, right? So there's a lot of things going on in bankruptcy court, right? So just to remind ourselves, probably, I guess in business law you learned about bankruptcy. So the U.S. Code provides that people can become bankrupt. And what this means is you get to walk away from your debts. And people have to quit calling you and bugging you, and they can't take things that they aren't given by the court. So what happens is, if you owe a lot of money, your business or your person, they can start taking things, right? Which could put you out of business. Let's suppose you've ordered a bunch of inventory and you have to go bankrupt. You're having a hard time. Well, if the creditor comes in and takes back that inventory, now you have nothing to sell, so you're for sure going to go down the drain. If you're a person who has lots of debts, you have a mortgage, you have a bunch of credit cards, you have a bunch of car loans, well, if you don't declare bankruptcy and stop the creditors, they're going to come evict you from your house, take back your cars, garnish your paycheck, and you can't do anything. So what people do is they declare bankruptcy. And now the court comes in, and the trustee steps in and says, okay, wait, stop, don't repossess the cars, don't foreclose on the house, don't take back the inventory, don't garnish their wages. Let's settle this all out, and you'll get everything, and they'll still have a place to live, but you'll get, so they kind of settle everything. And there's different types of bankruptcies depending on who you are. So Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 are used by either businesses or just an individual person, and they're two things. One is liquidation, and one is reorganization. So Chapter 7 is when you just say, I'm giving up everything, I'm done, come take the stuff. Bankruptcy court divided among the creditors, and I will just go on about my business. Chapter 11 is what's called reorganization. That's what businesses do. So it's kind of like, hey, I'm a business, I can still run if I can just get a little breathing room on these debts. So please, bankruptcy court, help get these creditors off my back. I'll pay everybody some or all of it at some point, but if they take my inventory away, I can't sell it. So that's kind of like what happens. They reorganize. Chapter 13 is for people, not businesses. They call it WEP, a wage earner plan. And basically, an individual with $1 million or less income, most people declare Chapter 13, and that way you say, look, I ran up my credit cards, I bought these 6 cars I couldn't really afford, I've got these car payments, and I've got a mortgage, but I'm a normal person, I have wages, I get this much, $60,000 per year, I can pay something, but I can't pay all of this. So maybe we can reorganize, and I can pay so much per month, and then everybody will be happy. Eventually, maybe instead of getting all their money next month, they'll get it over a couple of years, but it'll happen. So that's what a Chapter 13 bankruptcy is. All right, so there's bankruptcy fraud statutes, which are crimes. So if you commit bankruptcy fraud, it can be in prison. You can go to prison for that. Sometimes the bankruptcy trustees or the lawyers who are involved commit fraud, right? They take some assets for themselves, right? They're this third party. There's not that many people watching over them. They're the ones who are supposed to be doing the watching, right? So they sometimes embezzle or have poor conduct, committing fraud against the debtor's estate, right? It's like, oh, here's this car dealership with all these cars, and I'm going to take one of them for myself or something, right? So you can imagine that they might do something like that. And then there's bankruptcy fraud where the party that's declaring bankruptcy commits the fraud, and that's much more common. If you commit, so typically, if you commit bankruptcy fraud, the court will kind of not allow you to be bankrupt. In other words, if you say commit a bankruptcy fraud and you're trying to say, hey, don't let them take all my cash, don't let them garnish all my money, I need to stay in business. And they're like, well, yeah, but you committed bankruptcy fraud, you hid these assets from these creditors, you actually aren't bankrupt, maybe, you're just trying to get away with something. And so no, you're going to have to pay them. You don't get to have bankruptcy if you're not bankrupt, right? So who all is involved in a bankruptcy process? Well, there's a bankruptcy court. That's a federal court. There's the U.S. trustee, so that's a court-appointed or panel trustee. So those are trustees are who kind of take over what they call the debtor's estate. So a person or company that declares bankruptcy has an estate, right? It's all their stuff, that is all their assets that can be sold or used to repay debts. So these trustees are in charge of kind of figuring out what's going on and liquidating things as need be liquidated. Examiners, they go in and they figure out what's going on, they go and figure out what assets are there and what debts are there, and they tell the trustee, and the trustee is making the decision. Right? Debtors, that's the people who are declaring bankruptcy. Creditors, that's who's owed money and who wants to get money out of the bankruptcy court, but sometimes they don't get everything or even anything sometimes. But they have to show up and say, yes, we do. They'll get a notice and they'll say, hey, so-and-so's declared bankruptcy. Do you still want your money? And so now they have to go to court and say, yes, we still want our money. And adjusters, those are the people who go out and figure out what things are worth. The bankruptcy court allows the trustees to hire who they want to do this adjustments and go out and find things. They can use accountants, they can use certified fraud examiners, and sometimes fraud examiners will be used to help discover where assets have been hidden. The two most common bankruptcy schemes are what's called a bust out, or just like with a divorce, just fraudulently concealing your assets so that when you're legitimately going bankrupt, but you hide stuff from the bankruptcy court. So a bust out is basically where you take out a bunch of debt knowing you're going to declare bankruptcy on purpose, right? So we think of bankruptcy as like, oh, this person a little at a time got into debt, right? They got some credit cards. They bought a couple of expensive cars. They got a house that was maybe a little more than they can afford, or interest rates went up and their adjustable mortgage went up. And, these things happened and they got in over their head with debt. And a medical emergency occurred, right? Everything was fine, but then they had a medical emergency, they lost their job, we couldn't work anymore, right? COVID-19. So now they had to declare bankruptcy, right? It's like a legit thing, right? You lose your job, you get a divorce, something like that, and oh my gosh, I was able to pay these bills, now I can't, right? But there are people who abuse bankruptcy, who will go out and charge things up on purpose, and then, like, say 6 months down the road, just declare bankruptcy and, like, keep all the stuff they bought, right? And hide the stuff so that they can't get it back, right? So basically, you're borrowing money and then declaring bankruptcy. So if it works, you got a bunch of stuff, and maybe you sold all that inventory and got to keep the cash, and you hid that cash somewhere, right? So if it works, then you also don't have to pay back the debt. They may set up a new company, or they may use an established company and get legitimate credit and get suppliers to sell them goods, and then all of a sudden, oops, we're bankrupt. The second type of bust out, they just quietly buy a company that has a good reputation, take over its credit rating, run up a bunch of debt, and then go bankrupt. All right? How would you know if a bust out is coming? Right? So how would you, let's say you're a creditor, and you don't want to give money to somebody who's going to declare bankruptcy, right? So what could you look for? Well, just like any kind of fraud, right? They use a P.O. box, not a legitimate address. Vague about ownership, vague about management, changes in management, no actual credit references, really big orders all of a sudden being placed, right? Like if you normally sell a certain amount of stuff, you sell that amount of stuff, and all of a sudden you're ordering many times that, and that's it. So when a bust out occurs, that's fraud. Bust out is fraud. Intentionally running up debt to declare bankruptcy is fraud. Running up debt and then getting to a point where something happens and you can't repay it, that's not fraud, right? Just because you've run up debt doesn't mean you've committed fraud. But a bust out is you intentionally intended to do that. All right? So that's one kind of fraud, a bust out. You intentionally declare bankruptcy knowing, and you took out the debt knowing you were going to declare bankruptcy. Now, the other kind of fraud basically involves concealment, right? In other words, I never intended to declare bankruptcy, but now I had lost my job due to COVID-19 or whatever, and now I have to declare bankruptcy or else I'm going to lose my home. I can't have that happen, so I'm going to declare bankruptcy, right? So it's like a legit bankruptcy. But what they do that makes it fraud is they conceal their assets. Yes, I'm trying to keep from losing my home, but I also have this cash over here that I want to keep for my kids or something, right? So they conceal them. So our next video, we'll talk about concealment.